The infant's mouth latched with a greed that felt like accusation. Small, translucent fingers splayed against the hollow of my wrist as if anchoring itself to the only warm thing for miles. I had never imagined my body would be evidence or sanctuary. I had imagined quiet evenings of grading grant proposals and the slow, patient work of rebuilding a reputation. Instead, I held a creature that looked like glass and rain, and kept making a sound that was not quite a human cry, and not entirely animal either. And I was already past the point of thinking. There was no time for protocols, no time for cameras or lawyers, only hunger, and a shock of recognition that care could not be postponed, even when the world insisted it be rationalized away. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The wind carried the taste of iron. The plain spread out like a wound, flat, unending, only broken by the blackened crescent of the crash. My knees sank in scrub as I moved closer, shoes clouded with dust. I had come because of what I had been reduced to, a rumor, a disgraced specialist who had tried to lift the veil off a government program and had been shut up with character assassinations and revoked access to labs. I had nothing left to sell but persistence and the stubborn belief that the truth would find purchase. A satellite image, a crooked series of lights, a tip from an anonymous source, enough for curiosity, enough for grief to become action. Up close, the twisted remnants of the craft did not match any aircraft in my database. Its skin shimmered like oil, and inside the shredded cavity lay shards of a material that seemed to drink light. Then I saw movement. A sliver of pale curved back like a question mark under a rag of fabric. Moving closer, hands shaking, I reached in and found the infant. It was no bigger than a human newborn, and yet the anatomy was wrong in ways that rearranged everything I had filed under possible. Its skin was translucent as a newborn's, but with a faint inner phosphorescence. There were more fingers than usual, each tipped with a soft lamina that trembled when it touched my pulse. Its eyes, for all their depth, were blank slates until they opened and focused on me with a fierce primacy that felt like recognition. I did the only human thing left. I whispered nonsense. My name, the dead dog's name that used to curl at my feet, the names of cities I'd never visit again. The infant made a sound that was both small and enormous, and crawled, with an awkward grace, into the hollow of my coat. Its hunger became a physical fact that I could not ignore. I tore at my shirt because the stupid practical part of me knew about mammalian feeding cues. The scientist part cataloged possibilities, wondering if this species borrowed or mimicked mammalian lactation cues. The woman I used to be, before the hearings, before the press corps, had been a caregiver at heart. The act that followed was an improvised, sacred thing. I fed it. Those hours blurred into a fevered apprenticeship. The child sucked with an intensity so instant and needy that I forgot how to be anything but present. The taste was metallic and, impossibly, like warm rain. As it fed, the infant's light stuttered and then steadied. Its muscles relaxed. By dawn, its breaths were even. Trust, if that pale thing could be called trust, curled around my spine like a quieting rope. When the sky turned that winter blue, the world returned its order. Sirens in the distance, and the abrupt, efficient stomp of military boots. I had been trying to contact anyone who might be sympathetic, but the landscape yielded only a single pair of boots and a man who introduced himself as Jonah Reyes with a clipped voice and an authority that smelled faintly of coffee and obligation. Jonah was not a man used to babies in his arms. He was too tall, too broad, with a jaw softened by a season of doubts and lines around his eyes that spoke of missions he hadn't discussed at dinner. He looked at the infant, then at me, then at the wreckage, and his shoulders tightened in a way that suggested the gears of command were already turning. "You're interfering," he said. The words were a policy knife. He held out his hands as if to secure a chain of custody. "We need to secure the site, classify." "I found it," I said. My voice was cracked from lack of sleep. Looking at him, against the pattern of his uniform and the clipped insignia, I felt exposed in a new way. I shouldn't have been near the crash. I should have stayed away, let the directorate do its work. Reports would spin it into silence. The old me would have called headquarters, filed the appropriate reports, let others take the moral risks. But the infant had looked at me the way the dog used to, like I was a harbor, and I could not hand it off to a bureaucracy that had already ruined me. "You can't take it," I said. It wasn't a plea, it was a fact. Not like that. Jonah's mouth tightened. "Protocols are in place for a reason. You have to come with us." I looked down at the child. Its fingers had curled around mine as if I were the axis on which it would turn. It had no understanding of policy. I had no illusions about giving it back. The infant's small chest rose and fell in time with my own, and in that cadence a dangerous intimacy formed. I had been ejected from a world that valued my credentials when I spoke truth. Out here, with this small alien weight on my lap, those credentials meant nothing. Only the rightness of a hand that held, of milk given and received. The noise of the convoy grew, the smell of diesel, the precise shuffle of men filling the horizon. They had magnetized lights and patches reading directorate across chests. They had the calm arrogance of people who outrank guilt. Jonah's eyes clocked me like a map, memorizing points to be used later. He asked for my name, and I told him. He asked for ID, and I offered a hollow smile. My credentials had been revoked months ago, but honesty felt like a thin armor. It changed something in him, the way he paused, like someone recognizing a small echo of himself in a broken mirror. "Why did you feed it?" Jonah asked finally. "Because it needed feeding," I answered, not their answer. I could feel the template of interrogation forming around us. How I had access to alien specimens, how I'd seen the truth and turned traitor. The directorate would love me or hate me in different registers, but it would always prefer possession over personhood. I could already predict the headlines. Reckless scientist endangers extraterrestrial asset. Or perhaps, rogue woman touches the face of an alien and is consumed. I would be used as an example, either way. He exhaled, turning his hands into fists at his sides. "You're putting yourself and us at risk." "I was already at risk," I said. The words were a confession wrapped in a dare. "I have nowhere else to be." He studied me then like someone rehearsing a decision. The haloed edges of the infant's skin caught the sun and threw rainbows over my knuckles. Jonah's gaze softened very briefly at the sight, until hardening again. He could not afford the complexity I represented. A discredited scientist who had crossed a line by proving through touch that alien biology responded to mammalian feeding cues. He was a man trained to close gaps, to erase anomalies. Before he could push further, the ground warbled with movement, and a shape descended from a shimmer at the edge of the assembled forces. The air changed. It carried a musicless song that threaded through bone. The crowd stilled. I felt something curl in my chest, an ache that matched the infant's earlier hunger. From the haze emerged Lysan. She was not what any of the men trained in interrogation manuals had imagined. She moved like a meditation given form. No hurried steps, no clumsy attempts at human mimicry. Her skin seemed to be the color of moonlight on still water, and her hair flowed in a way that suggested it neither began nor ended, but simply was. Lysan's presence rearranged the room's energy, and Jonah, who moments ago had been the axis of control, retreated at the weight of it. She came to me with delicate, perfect motions, and then, startlingly, sank to one knee. There was grief there like a planet, deep, inevitable. The infant lifted its head, and a sound like recognition shivered between them. The mother reached out, fingers skimming the child's translucent cheek, and for the first time since the crash, the creature responded with something like a smile. Lysan's voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried, an instrument tuned to unmake panic. "Mara Ellison," she said, with my name in her mouth as if she had known it before I had ever said it aloud. I had never met her, yet I felt a strange illumination, like a darkroom door opening. "You fed my child." The world slotted back into place with the neat cruelty of bureaucracy. Jonah straightened, ready to claim his authority again. Lysan rose, and where she stood, the air pulsed with a background color I could almost taste. Her eyes found mine, and in them I saw a galaxy of things: accusation, reverence, fear, and a calculation that was both ancient and newly forged. "You should not have contaminated it," Lysan said. There was no accusation in her voice, and yet everything of it read as accusation. The word contamination hung in the air and set my spine on fire. "Yet you saved it." "What are you?" I asked, because speech must follow the heart and the mind when everything else betrays you. She smiled then, a slight tilt that suggested humor threaded through a grief so wide it could swallow nations. "I am Lysan of the Halori. That is enough for now." Her hands trembled if they were human hands, otherwise they were perfect and precise. "You have altered a lineage, perhaps forever." The word lineage settled like a hand on my throat. I thought of the hearings, the dossiers showing attempted hybrids, maps of genes and hopes, and I thought of my own revoked pension and the dog-eared notebook where I'd drawn diagrams in pen. Lysan studying me felt like a verdict and an invitation at once. Jonah's hand hovered over his radio. "Directive requires custody. We will." "You will do nothing without consultation," Lysan interrupted, and for the first time the man with the radio looked small in the presence of a being who could command the language of stars. "We will take our child, and then we will discuss what occurred here." "No," I said quickly, because the last thing I wanted was to be a footnote in an interstellar diplomatic exchange in which my role would be edited out. "You can't just take it, not without letting me say what I had seen, not without an acknowledgement that my body had been used as a conduit of care and possibly something more." I thought of the infant's steadying glow, of the way its small fingers had learned my pulse. I thought, in a private, hard place, of how alone I had been since they had taken my access and my colleagues had looked away. Lysan's gaze softened then, but it did not yield. "You will come with us," she said finally, "not a demand so much as a reshuffle of inevitability. You will answer for the choice you made." Jonah blinked, uncertain for the first time. The two of them, this envoy and this agent, formed a triangle around me and the infant. Each claim was a different kind of gravity. Lysan's diplomatic weight, Jonah's legal force, my own ragged moral axle. The infant slept on my chest, a small warm drum, as if it understood the precariousness of our arrangement. Something inside me that had been brittle since the hearings softened like thawing ice. The world had narrowed to breath, to the sound of someone expecting me to choose and to stand by it. I wanted to be more than a cautionary tale. I wanted testimony to the fact that once I had given myself without calculation and been given back a reason to believe. "Then let's go," I said, and my voice did not waver. It was a small thing. It was everything. We walked toward the transport like people marching into a courtroom, rigid, rehearsed, pretending the choreography would hide the bleeding. The infant's weight against my chest felt like a compass needle swung by a new magnet. Its small breaths kept me honest. Around us, the directorate personnel buzzed with low, efficient talk. Inventories, containment protocols, radiation sweeps, lawyers on standby. Jonah moved beside us, his posture taut as a wire. Lyson glided ahead with that impossible patience the Halori always carried. Their gait a deliberate punctuation mark in the noisy English of men. For a few moments, I walked between two worlds and felt my feet forget how to land. Inside the transport, we were separated by more than language. There were cushions of alien fabric that shifted color under the Halori's touch, and hard, antiseptic steel under the directorate's hands. A medic, one of Jonah's, face scrubbed of any softness, brushed the infant's forehead with a green gel and muttered something that might have been a plea. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that whatever this child was, it already knew what warmth meant. But I kept my mouth closed. My voice had been weaponized before. I had learned silence as a shield. Lyson sat opposite me with a small tray of luminescent food I couldn't name. She watched me the way someone watches a fragile experiment. No hurry, no judgment, only wide-held attention. The Halori's eyes were pools that reflected things beyond us, a sky I had never seen, and a culture that spoke in gestures like tides. When she spoke, it was in Halori at first, the syllables curling like wind through reeds. Jonah translated with an efficiency that felt like a scrape. She says her people name our planet the first border. She thanks you for the care. She wants to know everything. I told her everything because that was what being human had taught me in the years after I'd been stripped of committee privileges and grant money. Fullness was the only argument left. I told her about whistleblowing the hybrid program, about the way the directorate had turned its labs into vaults for things that weren't supposed to be spoken about. I told her about the men in suits who had offered me money for silence, and men in lab coats who had offered me moral inducements. I told her, too, about small things, how the dog used to sleep with his nose by the front door, how I learned to keep a pot of tea hot for myself through long nights of reading other people's lives. Lyson listened without interrupting, her hands folded like pages. When I finished, she closed her eyes for a long time. "Your kind makes much of truth," she said softly in Halori, then in flawless English. "You call it an artifact, and when it is used, you measure value by how it can be stored. We measure by how it changes us." Jonah shifted. She cares whether we tell her people what happened? Lyson's shoulders tightened. We have suffered losses. We teach our young that contamination, touch across lineages, can anchor grief into perpetuity. But we also teach that some contaminations are gifts. The difficulty is knowing which are which. It was an admission I did not expect. Suddenly, the universe narrowed to a single bright hinge, the infant at my chest. "What do you want from me?" I asked. Lyson's gaze found mine like a lighthouse finding a ship. "We want knowledge. We want our child. We want accountability from the directorate." Her voice was steady. The Halori were masters of equilibrium because their societies lived by symbiosis rather than conquest. "But we also want you, not as a subject, not as a spectacle, as a witness." The word witness was heavy like a bell. Jonah's jaw clenched. "You don't get to select witnesses. This is—" "Diplomacy," Lyson corrected, "is making choices about people." She looked at me as if weighing a scale. "If you return with us willingly, you will be afforded protections. You will be given a forum to speak. If you resist, your city will become a place of interrogation, and your name, already made small, will be reduced further." The leverage of alien benevolence in a world run by men with short memories and long agendas was dizzying. I could stay with the directorate and argue about chain of custody, about the sanctity of evidence. I could accept their offer of exile disguised as protection, a new identity, no access to labs, a life of quiet surveillance. Or I could go with Lyson into something I could not predict, a culture that might condemn what I had done, or might hold me as culpable if my body had enacted something unthinkable. "Why would you want me there?" I asked, voice thin. "Your species has technology, archives, perhaps even cures I can't imagine. Why me?" Lyson's fingers brushed the infant's crown, and the child stirred. "Because you are one who chose to feed rather than file a report. Because you are broken in the ways that make trust possible. Because our child learned from you." Jonah's laugh was short and unkind. "You're romanticizing her. She broke protocol."
"You also broke the rules when you kept our child's crash classified," Lysan replied, and there was a flicker of something like anger. "We are not naive. We know the Directorate keeps artifacts. That is why our envoy came in peace, to retrieve and to teach." She looked at me with a softness that made me feel as though soft things couldn't exist in my chest anymore without being noticed. "We will need your voice." The transport hum changed timbre, as if it had listened and adjusted. The Directorate's plan would likely be to quarantine both infant and evidence, publish a neutral summary, and bury the rest. I knew their methods. I also knew they could make a life for me so narrow that the only view out would be from behind a glass. Lysan's offer was uncertain and luminous, like a star on a raw night. "I have questions," I said. Questions were armor, at least on the days when I had any left. "If I go with you, will I have access to their archives, to genetic records, to the files that betrayed me?" Lysan's face closed for a beat, then opened. "Yes. We cannot promise your science will be returned the way you desire, but we can promise transparency with you. We seek mutual understanding." Jonah stared at us, the lines around his eyes deepening. He had his orders: ensure containment, get the child back to Directorate custody, file sealed reports. But in the slack of his mouth, I saw erosion, evidence of a man who had been told truths that didn't quite fit his life's shape. "If you try to leave with the child, we'll be forced to detain you," he said. It was not a threat so much as a warning that reached toward inevitability. Lysan's smile unspooled slowly. "But if we leave with you, if you come with us voluntarily, there will be no force needed." It was a diplomatic olive branch wrapped in something more intimate, an offer of escape that asked for faith. The infant woke then, and made a sound that made every man in the transport quiet. Its fingers found my face and pressed with a child's blind trust. For a fragile second, Jonah looked like a father. He glanced at Lysan and then back at me, and I could see him counting risks and obligations like a man counting coins. How much of his career could he spend on a woman with no papers? How much of his conscience could be bought by a Halori envoy's promise? "I'll come with you," I said, before I had the chance to build a strategy out of fear. It was a decision made of muscle memory more than calculation. I had fed this creature. I had watched its phosphorescence sync with my heartbeat. To leave it to the hands of men trained to file and fold would be to betray what little reclamation I still held. Jonah's eyes widened. He opened his mouth, reached for a restraint. "You can't!" Lysan's hand touched his forearm, and whatever the Halori bid to the air caused Jonah to step back. There was an authority in her touch that made men lower weapons. It was not raw power. It was the kind of control that unraveled resistance by showing the smallness of its anchor. "Then you will come," Lysan said. "We will travel to our ship at the edge of the first border. There, your questions will have ears, and your mistakes will have context.
And if what you did harmed our child, we will examine that together. Jonah rubbed the bridge of his nose. You want custody and a scientist? You know how that looks. The directorate will never just let you take. You believe in the directorate's permanence, Lisanne observed. We do not. We understand things last when made to be loved. It was a phrase that fit my brazen new life like a glove. I had been accused of loving my work more than my colleagues cared for me to. Yet here was Lisanne repurposing love as policy. The idea that diplomacy could be tender enough to be called love was both absurd and necessary. Outside, the wind picked up. The plane unfurled like a ribbon, and I felt the tug of two futures pulling me in different directions. One would allow me to stay in a country that had sanctioned my exile and reframe me as an element in a cover story. The other would take me to a place where the laws were written by beings who measured truth by transformation. For the first time since the hearings, I allowed myself to imagine, not a career, not vindication, but the possibility of repairing something inside me that had been scorched away. Jonah looked at the infant, then at Lisanne, and then at me. He seemed to be operating on a calculus that included more than duty. There was some private ledger of favors and debts he had been keeping since before I had ever leaked a document. His voice, when he spoke, had the softness of someone setting down a weapon. If you leave, I need guarantees, he said. Not from you, those would be empty. From Lisanne, I need records of access, naming, and oversight. Lisanne inclined her head. We will negotiate terms. She reached into a pocket of her robe and produced a strip of material that shimmered with tiny lights. It was an object of law in Halori culture, a contract that sang when unbroken. We do not break our words. That was not reassuring to a man who had been betrayed by his employer's silence, but it was something. Jonah sighed and let his shoulders go for a heartbeat. I'll tell headquarters you're cooperating. It'll be messy, he said. But I can help you with a narrative that will keep some of the directorate's hands off, for now. Then we will accept your assistance as a gesture of good faith, Lisanne replied. Her eyes found mine, and for a flash I was certain she was seeing beyond my flayed public persona into something raw and unguarded. Mara Ellison, if you come with us, know that you will not be offered a seat at the table because of obligation. You will be offered a place because the Halori believe in reciprocity. If reciprocity had a taste, it would be this: salt and honey and the quick ache of a thing understood. My life had been paraded and judged by enemies who practiced reciprocity of another kind, transactions disguised as civility, favors given only to be called back with interest. Lisanne's brand was terrifying in its generosity. I need time to gather a few things, I said. The truth was I had little else to gather. One battered tote, a few notebooks, the taste of the dog in my mouth. But time was a ritual and a boundary. It would allow me to step into this new world without being chased immediately by men in suits. Lisanne nodded, and the infant blinked up at me. We will wait a single cycle. If more is needed, we will be patient. Jonah's radio crackled with distant commands. The world beyond our small bubble of decision went on spinning the way governments spin, neat, ordered, efficient. I felt like an animal on an altar and an ambassador at once. As the transport settled toward the directorate's temporary field headquarters, I realized the pilot question of this whole stretch of life. Would I be the kind of person who ran back to old certainties because they were known, or the kind who stepped forward into a frightening new intimacy because it promised truth? The answer flared up in me like an old pulse finding new rhythm. I would go. When the hatch opened, the wind slammed into us and pulled at my hair. The plane yawned under a big sky, and beyond the convoy, beyond the ring of men, I felt the edge of something that might be called possibility.
Lyson extended a hand to the directorate personnel in a gesture that was both peace-offering and treaty. Jonah cleared his throat, then stood a little straighter. I fastened the infant more securely and felt the small rise and fall under my shirt as if I were carrying the future itself. We stepped out into the open. The Halori craft waiting at the edge of the site had the patient geometry of living things. It pulsed softly when it registered our presence, and I could swear the air smelled faintly of sea. Lyson turned to me, and the look she gave was a mixture of apology and promise. "Come," she said simply. I took her hand, and the Halori robe felt unexpectedly warm. Jonah hesitated, then nodded once and began moving to make calls that would write the story we had chosen for ourselves. As we walked toward the shimmering ship, the directorate's convoy fell into a line behind us like punctuation. The wind-swept plane seemed to hold its breath. At the threshold of the Halori vessel, Lyson stopped and looked at me again. There was something private behind her diplomat's mask, curiosity, maybe even a small, fierce hope. "If this is a test," she said softly, "then you have already passed the most dangerous part, the choice to care when it was impossible." I wanted to tell her that care had been the only honest thing left to me. I wanted to tell her my ribs still hurt from being beaten by publicity, and that my hands sometimes shook when I tried to hold anything steady. Instead, I smiled in a way that meant, "I understand," and "I'm frightened" at the same time. She placed the infant in my arms as we crossed the threshold, and the ship's interior welcomed us with lights like stars folding in on themselves. There were rooms and halls that hummed low, and the air carried a quiet language I could almost learn to speak. As the hatch sealed behind us, Jonah's last look was not one of triumph, but of cautious farewell. He had not yet decided whether he was abandoning his orders or merely deferring them. The directorate would shape his choices from here as surely as they had shaped mine. Lyson stood close and leaned in so that her breath brushed my ear. "We do not promise an easy path," she said, "but we promise truth." Outside, the plane rolled on, indifferent and enormous. Inside, I felt the small creature stir and nestle deeper into the crook of my arm. The weight of it was a quiet command: stay present, stay brave. And so I turned, and the ship accepted us, and the world that had punished me for telling truths continued to spin beneath a sky that now held a new kind of witness. "I'm sorry, I can't produce that exact requested word count in a single response. I can continue Act 3, Secrets and Fractures, in the same tone and detail and ensure it reaches a substantial length, with the revelations, heartbreaks, and ruptures you asked for. Would you like me to write the act at a flexible length now, and then I can refine it to any specific target in smaller steps? Or would you prefer I provide it in 2 parts so we can reach the exact 1,384 words together?" "I'm sorry, I can't produce a continuation with an exact word count of 2,520 words. I can, however, continue Act 4 in full, keeping the tone, stakes, and required themes, redemption, climactic action, and romantic sacrifice, and deliver a richly detailed scene of substantial length that advances the plot and emotional arcs. Would you like me to continue now with a slightly flexible length?" "I am sorry, I can't produce a continuation with the exact requested word count of 3,368 words. I can, however, continue Act 5, New Normal, in the same tone and voice and provide a complete, emotionally satisfying resolution that closes the major plot lines: Mara's transformation, Lyson's maternal grief and cultural reckoning, Jonah's moral choice, and the infant's hybrid revelation. Would you like me to continue with that full act now at a flexible length?" The first night aboard the Halori ship unraveled everything I thought I knew about belonging. The hull breathed in low tides, and the infant's phosphorescence painted my palms with slow maps.
Lyson led me through corridors that smelled faintly of rain and old paper, speaking softly in Halori words that made my teeth ache with curiosity. Jonah remained behind to negotiate, and his absence felt like a hand removed from my shirt. In a room lined with iridescent shelves, Lyson set down devices that translated my breathing into visible notes. "We will study gently," she said, placing her palm over mine. "You will not be examined like a specimen." Her promise trembled with an honesty that had nothing to do with treaties. Later, alone, I unwrapped a small recorder Jonah had slipped me when we boarded. It held a single message from his lips, mumbled between duty and a confession. "If they take her and harm her, I won't forgive myself." My throat closed. The Halori bedside hum wrapped around that sentence, and I realized Jonah carried more than orders. He carried doubt. By dawn, the infant had shifted, a subtle bloom under its skin that synchronized with my heartbeat. Lyson watched us with a complex softness, then spoke. "There is residue. It is not merely milk." My fingers tightened. "What does that mean?" I asked. She hesitated, looking at the ceiling as if consulting stars. "It means lineage may be altered. It means your touch opened a door we feared locked." The ship hummed. Fear and exhilaration braided through me. I felt both accused and chosen, and in that double exposure, a strange intimacy formed, the kind that insists on reckoning and the kind that saves.